Welcome to Healing Mindset, where transformation meets truth. Today, we are diving into the world of mindful living and self discovery with the remarkable Michelle Houston, the visionary behind, to be honest, Beverage Co. She's redefining what it means to celebrate without spirits, turning sobriety into empowerment and choice into confidence. So, hi, Michelle. Hi, welcome to my show.
Hi, Archita. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, great. So, Michelle, what was the pivotal moment that inspired you to step away from alcohol and embrace this new path of mindfulness?
Ultimately, it's never just one thing necessarily. At least it's usually multiple things, leading up to a particular incident. So I will share the story of the night that I made the actual decision. But I think over time, we go through seasons and we have different experiences and different instances in which make us realize, leading down that path of change, of shift. So I will say my relationship with alcohol was not necessarily a negative one. It was just such a prevalent one. I came from the alcohol industry. My husband was producing alcohol. We were involved in festivals, networking, events. I was a beer buyer at one point. And so we were just so integrated into that lifestyle that alcohol had become such a default to the way that we were leading our lives. And so one evening, I was at home by myself. My husband was working late and I was watching a romantic comedy and pulled out a bottle of rosé. And without thinking about it, I had consumed the entire bottle. And so that night and waking up the next day, it just made me realize why. Like, what am I doing? What are the choices that I'm making? And is alcohol something that I'm actively choosing, or is it because it's so accessible? It's right in front of me. It's the pressure, societal expectation. It's just a default, it's a habit. And so it made me question all of those things in the way in which I was living, in the way I was experiencing social engagements or just being by myself. And so with that question, it opened up, okay, time to make more of an intentional choice. So that's why I put a pause. And our goal, especially as a brand, is not necessarily to shame or make you feel guilty or bad about drinking. And so I drank for so long. That's not the goal. It's just about what is the intentional choice behind consumption? And when I was able to take that pause, it made me realize that every single time I got to decide, do I want to drink or do I not want to drink? What else am I going to drink instead? And so, with that intentionality, that's how I moved forward from that point.
Amazing, amazing. So, was it a quiet inner calling or a dramatic turning point for you?
I think that I've stumbled through, what is my purpose in life? What is going to make me fulfilled? What am I here to do? I think, at different times in our lives, we come back to those questions. And so, from an inner perspective, from a reflection perspective, from a sense of like who I am and what I'm here to do, I think that this is a big part of the story is helping others through either modeling behavior, inspiring, or educating and advice to help them decide what is intentional, mindful living? What is it from a choice perspective? How am I investing my time, my energy, my attention? So I think that's part of what I'm here to do. And then the other aspect of it is just, from a health perspective, from a wellness perspective, from how I want to see myself in the world, how I want to act, how I want to be, how I want to experience this particular life is a big part of that choice. So I think it's multifold, but I think that it's both driven by external perception and then also an inner need to have an impact.
Definitely. That's such a relatable journey. I mean, so many of us reach that enough is enough moment, but only few have the courage to turn it into a movement like you did. So amazing. How did your relationship with yourself evolve once you made that decision to live alcohol free?
It's the thing in my life that has completely changed me the most. Now, 3.5, 4 years later after stopping drinking, it's honestly more and more day by day, the thing that has impacted my identity more than anything else. And I didn't expect that. I didn't anticipate that that was going to be the case. But the further I got away from alcohol, I started leaning more into confidence, presence, willing to take on responsibility. Everyone drinks for different reasons. And considering the time and the environment and who you're with, it's all different. But for me, drinking was definitely a way of coping, avoiding, kind of a way of dealing with either mental, emotional, psychological things that I didn't want to address, or, the idea of like liquid courage or giving yourself something so that you can ease the anxiety in a social situation or handle stress better, even though technically alcohol does the exact opposite of all that. But it just kind of made me be more present with myself. It made me face things that I hadn't necessarily faced, and then it dominoed into other personal development choices and ways of exploring my identity, my past, dealing with, therapy and past trauma and addressing all of those things that I was not really wanting to address. So it really did motivate this different sense of self, and I would say separating myself from that and getting away from, again, what's the expectation? What's the pressure? What's the default? What's the habit? And then asking those questions of, okay, if I don't have my default, if I don't have the habits, if I don't have these behaviors that are put on me by society, by other people, by the situations at hand, then I have to actively choose a different path. I have to actively identify different ways of being in those instances that need to then come from me if they're outside of the norm. And so by doing that, it's helped change how I speak, how I hold myself, how I show up in different instances. And you go through this transition period where I feel like you feel left out. You feel like an outsider. And there's a certain sense of, your identity that you feel insecure, doubtful about, but eventually it becomes much more confident, much more grounded, much more capable in who you are, and I see that in other individuals as well, is that the further away you get from alcohol, you realize you're becoming more of yourself because you're not using an intoxicating substance to change, to alter, to adjust the person that you are meant to be. And then you're more available and open to connection because you're much more presence, right? You're just like you're embodying being in the moment and not pulling yourself out of. A lot of people drink to distract or get over or handle or manage. And when you're forced to do that and navigate your own emotions, you can't help but become more almost evolved on that front.
That's so true. But Michelle, you know how some people feel that socializing cannot happen without alcohol, that they need alcohol for every event, for celebrating something, or to cope emotionally. So, how did you find new ways to celebrate or cope emotionally without the drink in hand?
It definitely takes time. I think there is that transitionary period, which a lot of people talk about giving up alcohol or becoming alcohol free, sober curious, and choosing non alcoholic options as this is all the positive things about it, right? Like, the things that you experience in your life as a benefit. But there is this time in which, especially for us, when we were so centered around alcohol, your social engagements, your partnerships, your friendships, your networking, so much of what you do is integrated with alcohol that there is a little bit of an isolating period in which you question. You can't just have beer when you're watching a game with other people anymore. You're not going to go to the wine pairing dinners. You're not going to go to the same festivals, events, or activities that you might have been integrated into. And so I do think that there's a certain sense of understanding your why that I think is a really good initial step for most people. It's like, why are you transitioning away from alcohol? Why are you choosing not to drink in this instance? And knowing that internally gives you more confidence to show up so that you don't have as much anxiety or feel left out or frustrated. But then the other aspect of that is having additional options. And that's one of the reasons why we created, to be honest, Bev in the first place, is to have just as elevated, sophisticated, experiential options that taste great and that allow you to feel integrated and included in those activities that have alcohol, that are a part of that. In addition to, outside of those things that are centered around alcohol, you start looking for more physical activities. Start looking for different things that don't include alcohol outright, and that's not the focus. So I think we're seeing a huge shift in people moving towards pickleball, towards run clubs, towards DIY crafting nights, to going to, we don't live in a city necessarily, but escape rooms are really big. Going to different places that are like interactive art or play areas for adults. So I think that as a society, as a group, especially here in the US and then of course abroad as well, is that people are finding other ways to engage and people are seeking out either a health and wellness, more centered lifestyle based on their choices, or ways of having fun, connecting, socializing that don't center around alcohol. So I think looking for those groups, searching them out, Googling near me where you can find those things, especially if you're not wanting to be around alcohol right away, which is again kind of that transition period. Eventually, you get to a point that you're so confident, you don't care what anyone thinks, and you can show up to alcohol related or inspired events without worrying whether you're included or not, and you make yourself more sociable, because of that. But if you're not quite there yet, and if you're in that feeling isolated stage, seeking out those other activities and communities and social engagements that give you something different that aren't centered around alcohol. And I think that's a really positive way to kind of shift.
Yeah, it's inspiring how growth often comes from subtraction, removing something and finding wholeness in the space it leaves behind. So, Michelle, on that note, you have built, to be honest, Beverage Co. around mindful drinking. What kind of emotional or spiritual intention guides your brand?
So we have the mission and the goal of making every consumer the main character of their story. So that has a lot to do with intentional living, mindfulness, self awareness, and really understanding who you are and how you want to show up. Because so often when you transition away from alcohol, you become the afterthought, right? If you go to an event, and I've had this happen in events that I've either paid for or attending, is where alcohol is the number one, and that's kind of sort of the main thing that you get out of the experience. And then if you're not drinking, "Oh, I have water. Oh, there's lemonade behind you. Oh, it's just not a catered experience." And drinking culture is actually less about what's actually in the glass. It's more about the experience and how you feel related to that engagement. So if you walk into a bar environment and there's no non-alcoholic options on the menu, you don't know what to order, you don't know which direction to go, you're not really feeling catered to. Versus if you walk into an environment and someone has listed options on the menu, the drinks are just as well crafted, just as well thought out, alcohol or not, you're going to have a very similar feeling if you're feeling catered to. So I think that's a big part of it is setting the expectation, setting the bar for what it means to have an experience related to alcohol. And so that's ultimately what we're trying to curate. So it's not just about the product, it's about your energetics. It's about how you feel, it's about how you respond. Now, from a spiritual perspective, we don't necessarily get into that as a brand necessarily, but I do think that there is kind of when it comes to purpose, when it comes to intentionality, when it comes to connection, when it comes to being present, a lot of that is related to meditation, mindfulness, praying, like having some type of spiritual connection that doesn't lean a particular direction or isn't necessarily geared towards a religion, but allows you to kind of have more of a next level consciousness and an identity in the world. So our brand is again focused on intentional, mindful, kind of elevated living as a whole. And I think collectively with that, we tend to attract audience members and people who have more of a guiding light when it comes to how they want to live their lives. And I think, if you look at Buddhist practices, for example, it could be considered a religion or a spiritual practice to some degree, but ultimately it's just principles of living. And that's kind of the way that we see it, at least the way that I see it, as the founder of the brand, is that every single day, every moment, every minute, every hour, you know, the weeks, the days, the months, the years, that's all creating your life. And so if you bring intentionality, if you bring presence, if you bring mindfulness, if you bring active choice into all of those instances, into all of those moments, that is a belief system. That is a way of life. That is a spiritual practice in and of itself.
Wow, your brand sounds very interesting. And yes, it needs to be known more about, like, there needs to be more awareness about something like this. So I'm glad you brought something, you founded something like that for us, you know, for us people who don't consume alcohol. So amazing work. But Michelle, do you think consumers today are craving more consciousness in their choices?
Absolutely. I think that we're seeing it across the board in all industries is that the consumer, the customer is becoming the pinnacle of basically brand fulfillment and development. We are seeing a world in which people are speaking out. They want transparency, they want integrity, they want ethics, and consumer and buyer behavior is determining business success. And so, from a US standpoint, if you look at DIE, if you look at did I say DIE? I think DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. If you look at some of the regulations that are coming through from a government perspective, if you look at consumers that are boycotting certain brands, if you look at the way that they're responding to celebrities and influencers in the digital space, we are at a very interesting time in which people vote with their dollar. And whereas sometimes you don't always have the information and sometimes you just do what you have to do to get by, I think that brands and businesses are more aware now than ever that their marketing campaigns, their positioning, their messaging, their sourcing, their production, their customer experience is being scrutinized and has the ability to make or break brands, if not investment. Having stocks drop because of the way that you handle the situation is showing in our world. And so I think that the consumer has more control and more power than they ever have before. And with that, they're demanding certain things. And I think we're going to see that more and more and more. There are, of course, tons of businesses, tons of brands, tons of entities that still get away with a lot of either corrupt behavior, poor sourcing practices, bad labor practices, and things that they're doing behind the scenes, but we're leading hopefully more towards transparency in a lot of ways and demanding that, again, brands and businesses show up in integrity and in alignment with what they're trying to create in the world. So I think we're headed in a positive direction as in a whole front on that side of things.
Yeah, that awareness feels like the next big shift in culture, from indulgence to intention. So, what are some of the myths or pressures around alcohol that you wish people would question more?
The pressures around alcohol, I think, really related to the couple of words that I've mentioned before is habit and default. It's kind of the expectation. Again, cultures are different and around the globe it's a little different here and there, but from what I've seen here in the US and then I've spent more time in like the UK in certain European areas is that alcohol is integrated. It's so integrated into our lives. It's not a question of whether or if you're going to drink, but typically just when and how. And so because it's an expectation, it negates that chance for choice, options, doing something differently. And when it comes to questioning the pressures is questioning yourself and the choices that you're making and the way in which you are showing up again in your life. It all comes down to that self-awareness and that way in which you're engaging with the world, because that's how you're spending your time. That's how you're spending your energy. That's what leads to your priorities and your goals and is cultivated by your values. And then again, how you're investing your time is how your life is created. And if you have milestones that you're working on, ways that you want to live from a desirable perspective, whether that's your home environment, whether that's your professional world, whether that's a relationship that you want to cultivate, all of the ways in which we engage, you start to, again, question. And so, is it a pressure? Is it an expectation? Is it something that someone is putting on you? Or are you actively and intentionally making that choice? And so, allowing yourself to assess, where are you in the world? What are you engaging with already that has alcohol as the go-to, as the default, as the habit? And then letting it domino. So, it's not just about your drinking, it's about what you're eating. It's about how you're sleeping. It's about the practices that you have throughout the day. It's about the way that you are talking to people and the social relationships that you have. For us, drinking and beverage is just kind of the catalyst. It's the initial medium, but just like transitioning away from alcohol really changed my entire life in a big way, it does for a lot of people. It can be that kind of like initial domino that falls that then improves your diet. And then you work out more because you're not feeling terrible. And then you sleep better because you're not drinking. And then you have better relationships because you're not hungover and snappy with your kids or with your spouse. And then you have a better working environment. It's a domino effect. And so when you look at the pressures in our lives, you have to think, what is an expectation? What is a default? What is a habit that I'm doing right now in my life? And then how can I question that? And then I think from a general consumption perspective is that oftentimes, if we're going to a bar, to a restaurant, again, the consumer drives that behavior. And with the consciousness that's expanding in consumers and how they know they have power, is if you go into that bar and restaurant environment and you're choosing not to drink and they don't have non alcoholic options for you and they just offer you a soda, one, from a business perspective, they're missing out on higher ticket value. And so they're making a poor business decision. But two, is the consumer asking them, why don't you have curated non alcoholic options on the menu? I want to spend money in your establishment. I have friends who want to come here and enjoy your food, but get just as equally sophisticated, elevated adult alternatives as your cocktail menu. And so I think we get to question that. We get to demand that. And where it used to be that non alcoholic options were a little bit flavorless, a little bit sugary, not so great, which some of them on the market they still are. But again, as consumers, we get to demand a change. We get to make and request those things in order to see that shift.
True, very, very true. But social circles also play a very important role in deciding how much alcohol we consume or how much alcohol is integrated into our lives. So, how can social circles better support those choosing sobriety or moderation?
This is such a great question because they say that the five closest people in your life determine your state of health, your financial well being, so much about your life. And when you are making choices, it's one thing to make those choices in isolation, but you're often not. A lot of the questions that I get from consumers and our audience about, especially in relationship with their partner or spouse, like if they're trying to transition away from alcohol, but their partner consumes alcohol, it makes it a lot more challenging, right? So the people who are around you, or if let's say those people in your social circle, if they're going to be more supportive, I would start by not asking imploring questions. It's like as I get older, there's definitely questions about kids, for example, and people asking like, when are you going to have kids? Are you going to have kids? Like, why haven't you guys had kids yet? Just all of those things that are a little bit more personal and kind of unnecessary in terms of the approach. And so when it comes to alcohol, it's similar. If someone's asking like, why aren't you drinking? And now that can be an understandable question if they're curious and they just want to start a conversation. But I think a lot of times it's laced with judgment. And if anything, it's funny because people who are drinking alcohol think that not people who are not drinking are going to judge them, but it's actually often the opposite. So people who are drinking are judging the people who are not drinking. So I think if you're the social group who someone has chosen not to drink is releasing the judgment, releasing the need to get them on board because a lot of social pressure with, oh, just have one. Oh, you'll be fine. Like, yeah, just have a drink. Oh, I'll get it for you. It's not that big of a deal. Or again, asking those questions from a judgmental perspective in terms of why aren't you drinking and what is happening to you as if something's wrong with you because you're not drinking, or oh, you must have some type of problem because you're not drinking, or you must be pregnant because you're not drinking, or you must fill in the blank of whatever you think the situation is. And so in a social setting, you can choose places that have non-alcoholic options that cater to both drinking and not drinking, being more inclusive. When you host someone in your space, having again great either non-alcoholic beer or wine to match beer or wine, or offer again a non-alcoholic spirit in the cocktails that you're mixing up so that you have options for people who are coming to you instead of assuming that everybody drinks alcohol. If you're planning something with friends, your social group is planning something, maybe it's not a beer festival that you go to. Maybe it's, again, an escape room or something that's slightly different, that DIY craft night that you don't have to drink at. So I think starting with the perception of the person who is not drinking and changing that away from judgment, away from guilt, away from the expectation, and then curating experiences that is just as inclusive. It's like vegetarians. Like if you have a vegetarian or a vegan in your group, you're not going to go to a barbecue joint that doesn't have any vegetarian option. You want to think of being inclusive and thinking through what it means for that person to make an intentional choice and then offer spaces and ways to engage that allows for both your choices and their choices. It's being respectful on a whole new level.
Absolutely. That's a much needed conversation. It's not about restriction, but it's about respect for personal evolution. So, Michelle, lastly, if any of our listeners want to connect with you and learn more about your brand, how can they do that? Would you share it with them?
Absolutely. So you can find us on most platforms at To Be Honest Bev. That's TOBE Honest. And Bev is in beverage. So Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, that's where we share a lot of our current content. And you can find us online. Currently, right now, we only ship within the US, but you can order a bottle of our non alcoholic functional spirit at tobehonestbev.com. Really, ultimately, our goal with our products is to replace the liquor or alcohol in your drink so that, especially when it comes to habit formation or default or experience, is that you get to enjoy a flavorful, functional option in your glass that doesn't have any after effects, intoxicating experiences. There's no buzz, no high related to consumption.
Great. So, I'll have all the details on my show listing so that our listeners can know more about your brand and even maybe order one. So, thank you so much, Michelle, for being a guest on our show. This conversation was truly liberating, and I'm sure that it helped a lot of our listeners too. So, dear listeners, what a refreshing and eye opening talk. Michelle reminds us that growth isn't always about adding more. Sometimes it's about reclaiming clarity, confidence, and connection. So, if today's conversation sparked something in you, then take a moment to reflect on what you are truly celebrating in life. Until next time, stay mindful, stay authentic, and keep healing forward.